In June of 1939, a group of medical students gathered in Cincinnati to receive their diplomas. Parents filled the room. Professors shook hands. Photographs were taken. For the graduates, it should have been one of the happiest days of their lives. Instead, many of them were stepping into a profession that was disappearing beneath their feet. The school they attended, the Eclectic Medical Institute, was one of the last major institutions of its kind in America. For decades, it had trained physicians, published medical journals, and educated doctors who practiced across the country. Now it was nearing the end. Within months, the school would close. There would be no new incoming class, no future graduates, no next generation. And with its closure, one of the most influential movements in American medical history would effectively lose its final training ground. That alone would be a remarkable story. But the real question is this: how does an entire profession almost disappear? Because that's exactly what happened. At the beginning of the 20th century, eclectic medicine was not some obscure fringe movement. It operated hospitals, published textbooks, maintained professional organizations, and trained thousands of physicians. Yet by the time those students crossed the stage in 1939, most Americans had never heard of it. Something extraordinary had happened between those two moments, and at the center of that story stood a man who wasn't even a doctor. His name was Abraham Flexner. In 1908, Flexner received an assignment that sounded surprisingly simple: travel across the United States and Canada, visit medical schools, evaluate what you find, write a report. Today, that assignment sounds routine. At the time, it would help reshape the future of medicine. Before Flexner began his journey, the United States had more than 150 medical schools. Some were attached to major universities. Others operated independently. Some emphasized laboratory science. Others emphasized hands-on clinical observation. Some taught homeopathy. Some taught eclectic medicine. The system was diverse, competitive, and often chaotic. Critics argued that too many schools accepted poorly prepared students. Too many lacked proper laboratories. Too many graduated doctors with inconsistent training. Supporters countered that these schools helped provide medical care to a rapidly growing nation. Both sides believed they were defending the future of American medicine. The conflict was already brewing long before Flexner arrived. But Flexner's report would pour fuel on the fire. As he traveled from campus to campus, he found schools that impressed him and others that alarmed him. He inspected classrooms, examined laboratories, questioned administrators, compared institutions against the standards emerging from leading European medical schools. When his findings were published in 1910, the impact was immediate. One physician later described the report as a bomb exploding in the center of American medical education. Schools praised by Flexner proudly advertised the fact. Schools criticized by him faced a very different future, and the numbers tell the story. In 1900, America had more than 150 medical schools. Within a generation, that number had been dramatically reduced. Some institutions merged, others closed. Entire medical traditions began shrinking. The effects were not limited to administrators and professors. They reached students. Young men and women who had invested years preparing for careers suddenly found themselves wondering whether their schools would survive. One student attending an eclectic medical college in the years after the report watched neighboring institutions disappear one by one. Every closure carried a new warning. If another school vanished this year, would his be next? Would his degree still carry value when he graduated? Would there even be a profession left to join? Those fears were not imaginary. By the 1930s, the medical world looked dramatically different from the one that had existed when Flexner began his investigation. Schools had vanished. Professional networks had weakened. Entire branches of medicine were fighting for survival. And nowhere was that struggle more visible than in Cincinnati. There, a physician named Harvey Wicks Felter watched the profession he had spent his life serving slowly contract around him. Felter was not a radical. He was a respected doctor, teacher, and editor. He believed medical education should be rigorous. He believed physicians should be well trained. But he also believed that something important was being lost. As schools closed and enrollment declined, he faced a question that would haunt many of his colleagues. If the institutions disappear, what happens to everything they taught? For years, that question seemed academic. Then the closures accelerated, and suddenly it became urgent. Because while some schools were fighting to survive, others had already accepted their fate. Their libraries were being packed into boxes. Their records were being moved into storage. Their faculty were retiring without replacements. A medical world that had taken decades to build was beginning to vanish. Yet the strangest part of the story is that not everyone welcomed the changes, and not everyone opposed them. Some physicians celebrated the reforms. Others feared them. Some believed American medicine was finally becoming more scientific. Others worried that valuable knowledge was being discarded before it had been fully understood. The debate was fierce, and the consequences would shape generations of doctors. But before we can understand who was right, who was wrong, and who paid the price, we need to step inside the world that existed before the collapse began. Because the America Flexner encountered in 1908 was far stranger, far more diverse, and far more contested than most people realize. And once we see that world, the battle over its future starts to make a lot more sense. In 1908, when Abraham Flexner stepped off trains and into medical schools across North America, he entered a world that would seem almost unbelievable today. There was no single path to becoming a doctor. In some schools, students spent years studying anatomy, chemistry, pathology, and clinical medicine under strict academic standards. In others, requirements were far less demanding. The difference could be enormous. One critic of the era joked that America had some of the best medical schools in the world, and some of the worst. The numbers explain why reformers were worried. At the start of the 20th century, the United States and Canada had more than 150 medical schools, serving a population of roughly 90 million people. Many schools competed fiercely for tuition-paying students. Some accepted applicants with little formal education. Others lacked proper laboratories or teaching hospitals. Flexner would later describe certain institutions in devastating terms. Yet as he traveled, he discovered something else. American medicine wasn't just divided by quality, it was divided by philosophy. And that division would become the heart of the conflict. One school might teach conventional medicine, another might teach homeopathy, a third might teach eclectic medicine. Each believed it offered patients the best chance of recovery. Each trained doctors, each had supporters, and each viewed the future differently. To understand why that mattered, imagine a young student arriving in Cincinnati in 1905. His goal was simple: become a physician, help patients, build a career. When he enrolled at the Eclectic Medical Institute, he entered one of the most influential schools of its kind in the country. Students there studied many of the same subjects taught elsewhere: anatomy, physiology, obstetrics, surgery, diagnosis. But they were also taught therapeutic approaches that conventional schools increasingly viewed with skepticism. To supporters, this broader education was a strength. To critics, it was a weakness. At the time, neither side knew which vision would win. What they did know was that medicine itself was changing at extraordinary speed. In Germany, researchers were transforming medical science through laboratory investigation. Across Europe and North America, scientists were identifying disease-causing bacteria. Hospitals were becoming centers of research rather than simply places of care. New discoveries seemed to arrive every year. The world Flexner observed was standing at the edge of a revolution, and powerful people wanted to accelerate it. One of those people was John D. Rockefeller. By 1908, Rockefeller's fortune was almost beyond comprehension. Through organizations like the General Education Board, money from his foundations began flowing into education and public health. The sums involved were enormous. Schools desperately needed funding. Laboratories needed equipment. Universities needed buildings. Medical education was becoming more expensive every year. This created a reality that many school administrators could not ignore. A favorable reputation could attract funding. An unfavorable reputation could make survival far more difficult. That's why Flexner's investigation caused so much anxiety before his report was even published. Administrators knew powerful institutions were paying attention, and they knew the future might depend on the outcome. When Flexner arrived at a school, word often spread quickly. Faculty members prepared for inspections. Students speculated about what he might write. School leaders worried about how they would compare against competitors. For some institutions, those fears proved justified. In 1910, Flexner published his findings. The report was more than 300 pages long. It named schools, praised some, condemned others. And unlike many reports that quietly disappear, this one landed at exactly the right moment to influence the future. The impact was immediate. Schools receiving positive reviews highlighted them in advertisements. Schools receiving harsh criticism scrambled to respond. Some attempted reforms. Some sought mergers. Some entered a downward spiral from which they never recovered. One medical college saw enrollment decline sharply after receiving negative attention. Another fought desperately to improve facilities before prospective students looked elsewhere. Across the continent, administrators were reading the report and asking the same question: can we survive this? For students, the uncertainty was even more personal. Imagine spending years and money pursuing a degree while hearing rumors that your institution might not exist by the time you graduate. That wasn't a theoretical concern. It was becoming reality. And nowhere was the anxiety greater than among schools outside the emerging mainstream. Homeopathic colleges worried. Eclectic colleges worried. Independent institutions worried. They could all see the direction medicine was moving. The question was whether there would still be room for them in that future. One person watching these developments closely was Harvey Wicks Felter. By this point, Felter had already dedicated much of his life to eclectic medicine. He wasn't merely teaching students. He was helping preserve an entire professional tradition. And as he read the report and watched schools struggle, he realized something alarming. The danger wasn't simply that institutions might close. The danger was that once they disappeared, future generations might never understand what those institutions had actually been. That fear would shape the next chapter of the story. Because after the report came the consequences. And those consequences arrived faster than almost anyone expected. Within just a few years, schools were closing. Within a few decades, entire branches of American medicine would be fighting for survival. And for the students sitting in those classrooms, the future was about to become much more uncertain than they had ever imagined. By 1915, the warnings were no longer theoretical. Medical schools were closing. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to make people nervous. A student entering medical school in 1900 could choose from a vast and diverse landscape of institutions. A student entering 15 years later faced a very different reality. Across the country, administrators were making difficult decisions. Some schools merged with larger universities. Some spent enormous sums trying to modernize laboratories and teaching hospitals. Others simply couldn't keep up. The pressure came from several directions at once. State licensing boards were raising standards. Universities were becoming more influential. Funding increasingly flowed toward schools that matched the new model of scientific medicine. And every year, the gap between the strongest institutions and the weakest grew wider. For the students caught in the middle, it could be frightening. In Chicago, New York, Cincinnati, and dozens of other cities, rumors spread through classrooms and dormitories. Would their school survive? Would employers respect their degree? Would they need to transfer before graduation? Those concerns weren't imaginary. Some schools disappeared so quickly that students were forced to scramble for alternatives. Others watched class sizes shrink year after year. A profession that once seemed secure suddenly felt uncertain. One of the clearest examples came from the world of homeopathic medicine. At the turn of the 20th century, homeopathic colleges and hospitals could be found across the United States. Many had thousands of loyal patients. Some were attached to respected institutions. Yet after 1910, their numbers steadily declined. By the middle of the century, most had either closed, merged, or abandoned their separate identity. The same pattern appeared in eclectic medicine. But for eclectic physicians, the decline felt especially personal. They had spent decades building schools, journals, and professional organizations. Many believed they had already embraced scientific standards while preserving approaches they considered valuable. Yet the world around them was changing faster than they could adapt. Harvey Wicks-Felter saw it happening in real time. As editor, educator, and physician, he occupied a front-row seat to the transformation. He read the reports, watched enrollments fluctuate, listened to colleagues debate strategy, and perhaps most painfully, he watched younger physicians choose different paths. For decades, ambitious students had entered eclectic schools. Now many were heading toward larger university programs instead. The profession wasn't merely losing institutions. It was losing future generations. Why does this matter? Because professions survive through renewal. A school can survive financial hardship. A journal can survive low circulation. But if young people stop entering the field, the future begins to disappear. And that is exactly what was happening. The numbers reveal the scale of the change. In the early 20th century, America had more than 150 medical schools. Within a few decades, that number had been dramatically reduced. Supporters of reform viewed this as evidence of progress. They argued that weaker schools were being replaced by stronger institutions with better standards. And in many cases, they were right. Medical education became more rigorous. Scientific training improved. Research expanded. But the story didn't end there. Because while schools were closing, something unexpected was happening inside laboratories. Researchers were beginning to investigate substances that physicians in older traditions had used for years. Plants, extracts, compounds, materials that had once been prescribed by doctors whose schools were now disappearing. Some investigations led nowhere. Others produced surprising results. Scientists occasionally discovered that certain plants contained powerful chemical compounds with measurable effects on the human body. The irony was difficult to ignore. At the same moment, some medical traditions were fading. Pieces of their knowledge were being studied through the very scientific methods that had helped push them aside. This wasn't a victory for either side. It was a contradiction, and contradictions often reveal the most interesting parts of history. The deeper you look, the harder it becomes to divide the past into simple categories of right and wrong. Meanwhile, another battle was unfolding far from laboratories and classrooms. It was taking place inside libraries. As schools closed, questions emerged about what would happen to their records. Textbooks could be reprinted. Buildings could be demolished. But journals, letters, research notes, and institutional archives were much more vulnerable. Once lost, many could never be replaced. One man understood that danger better than almost anyone. John Uri Lloyd, pharmacist, chemist, researcher, collector. By the 1920s, Lloyd had spent decades assembling one of the largest collections of medical and botanical literature in the country. Visitors who entered his library encountered shelves packed with books, journals, correspondence, and manuscripts gathered from across the medical world. To some observers, it seemed excessive. Why preserve all this material from professions that were shrinking? Lloyd's answer was simple: because future generations would need the evidence. Without evidence, people would remember only arguments, not reality. And already reality was becoming harder to see. As schools disappeared, public memory began simplifying the story. Scientific medicine won, alternative systems lost, case closed. But Lloyd suspected history would prove far more complicated, and he was right. Because while institutions were disappearing, the people who built them were still alive. They still had stories to tell. They still had records to preserve. And they were about to begin one final effort to ensure their profession would not simply vanish without a trace. What happened next would determine whether future historians could reconstruct this forgotten world, or whether it would disappear into myth forever. By the late 1920s, many eclectic physicians had stopped asking whether their profession was in trouble. That question had already been answered. The new question was whether anything could be saved. The signs were everywhere. Enrollment was falling. Schools were struggling. Professional journals that once reached thousands of readers were becoming thinner with each passing year. At medical conferences, familiar faces were growing older. What worried many leaders wasn't simply the decline itself. It was the lack of replacements. For decades, young physicians had entered the profession and carried it forward. Now fewer were arriving, and those who did often faced difficult choices. A graduate could remain loyal to a shrinking medical tradition, or he could join the rapidly expanding mainstream institutions that increasingly controlled hospitals, research opportunities, and professional recognition. Many chose the second path, not because they hated their training, because they wanted a future. One professor privately admitted that he could hardly blame them. A young doctor starting a family had to think about employment, income, and long-term stability. Idealism was one thing, paying bills was another. Those practical realities were slowly reshaping American medicine. Yet while the profession contracted, its leaders refused to disappear quietly. Harvey Wicks Felter became part of a determined effort to preserve what they believed future generations might need. One of the most important projects was King's American Dispensatory. The work had begun decades earlier, but by the early 20th century it had become one of the largest reference books produced by the eclectic tradition. Thousands of pages, hundreds of medicinal substances, decades of clinical observations, case reports, preparations, dosages, discussions, arguments. Whether later researchers agreed with every conclusion was beside the point. The book preserved a record of what physicians had actually believed and practiced. That mattered, because history was already beginning to change shape. As schools closed, fewer people remained who could explain how these institutions had operated. Myths started filling the gaps. Some critics dismissed the entire movement as unscientific quackery. Some supporters claimed it had been completely destroyed by powerful interests. Both stories were appealing. Neither captured the full reality. The truth was harder to fit into a slogan, and then something happened that made preservation feel even more urgent. The closures accelerated. One school disappeared, then another, then another. Each closure carried consequences beyond the loss of a building. Libraries were broken apart, faculty scattered, research collections vanished into storage rooms, student records were boxed up. In some cases, decades of institutional history nearly disappeared overnight. One former faculty member later described walking through nearly empty halls where classrooms that once held dozens of students now sat silent. The image stayed with him for years, not because he believed every aspect of the profession deserved saving, but because he understood he was watching the end of something that had once mattered to thousands of people. Why does this matter? Because history often remembers victories better than endings. We hear about the rise of powerful institutions, the success of reforms, the growth of new ideas. We hear less about the people left behind. Yet those people often reveal the true cost of historical change. By the 1930s, that cost was becoming impossible to ignore. Students entering eclectic schools understood they were joining a shrinking world. Some hoped they could help revive it. Others simply wanted to graduate before another closure occurred. Imagine sitting in a lecture hall knowing your profession might not exist in recognizable form 20 years later. That wasn't a dramatic exaggeration. It was becoming reality. and nowhere was that reality more visible than in Cincinnati. There, John Uri Lloyd was engaged in a race against time. Unlike many of his colleagues, Lloyd had stopped focusing on saving institutions. He was focused on saving evidence. Books, letters, journals, research notes, photographs, anything that documented the world that was disappearing. His collection grew year after year. Visitors often struggled to understand why he devoted so much energy to preserving material from schools and professions that seemed destined to fade away. Lloyd saw something they didn't. History has a habit of becoming simpler over time. Complicated events become simple stories. Competing perspectives disappear. Nuance gets lost. Evidence gets forgotten. Unless someone preserves it, that belief would eventually prove invaluable. Because decades later, historians would return to those collections looking for answers, and what they found would challenge assumptions on all sides. The surviving documents revealed physicians arguing among themselves, schools experimenting with reforms, students debating their futures, leaders struggling with decisions that had no easy solution. The past looked far less certain than later generations imagined. But before historians could rediscover that complexity, the profession itself faced one final blow. By the end of the 1930s, the last major eclectic medical school in America was approaching its final days. The battle to save the profession had largely been lost. What remained was a smaller, more personal battle, the effort to preserve its memory before the people who remembered it were gone. And that effort would leave behind one of the most surprising legacies in the entire story. The final blow did not arrive with a dramatic government decree. There was no nationwide announcement, no front-page headline declaring the end of eclectic medicine. Instead, it happened the way many historical endings happen, quietly. In 1939, the Eclectic Medical Institute in Cincinnati closed its doors. For nearly 100 years, eclectic physicians had trained doctors, published journals, operated professional organizations, and participated in the broader medical world. Now their last major medical school was gone. A student entering medical school in 1940 could no longer choose the path that thousands before him had followed. For the first time in generations, the profession had lost its ability to reproduce itself. And that changed everything. The closure affected more than students. Professors suddenly found themselves without classrooms. Libraries faced uncertain futures. Research collections lost institutional support. Graduates watched the profession that had shaped their identities slip further into history. One physician described the feeling as attending the funeral of a living thing. The people remained. The patients remained. But the system that connected them was disappearing. For supporters of reform, however, the story looked very different. By the late 1930s, scientific medicine was producing results that would have seemed extraordinary only a few decades earlier. Laboratory research was expanding rapidly. Medical schools were becoming more standardized. Teaching hospitals were growing in influence. The model championed by reformers appeared to be succeeding. And then came one of the most important medical breakthroughs in history: penicillin. Although discovered earlier, its widespread development during the 1940s transformed medicine. Diseases that had once killed millions suddenly became treatable. The impact was difficult to overstate. For many physicians, this seemed to confirm that medicine's future belonged to scientific research and laboratory-based investigation. Why does this matter? Because it helps explain why the old medical systems struggled to attract new generations. Young students weren't comparing two static options. They were watching one side produce breakthrough after breakthrough. In that environment, the momentum became almost impossible to resist. Yet even as scientific medicine surged forward, an unexpected twist emerged. Some of the people preserving the records of older traditions weren't doing so because they wanted to reverse progress. They were doing it because they feared something else: historical amnesia. John Uri Lloyd had spent decades building his collection, By the time of his death in 1936, he had assembled an extraordinary archive. Books, manuscripts, medical journals, letters, research notes, thousands upon thousands of documents. At first glance, it looked like a collection. In reality, it was insurance. Insurance against forgetting. Because Lloyd understood that future generations might ask questions nobody was asking in his own time. What did these physicians actually believe? What treatments did they use? Which ideas succeeded? Which failed? What was lost? What was preserved? Without evidence, those questions would never be answered. And remarkably, Lloyd's prediction came true. Decades later, historians began reopening boxes and examining materials that had survived largely because people like Lloyd refused to throw them away. What they found surprised them. The records did not reveal a simple story of heroes and villains. They revealed arguments, experiments, failures, successes, adaptations, compromises. The past looked much more human than either side had claimed. Then another discovery complicated the picture even further. Researchers investigating the history of pharmaceuticals noticed that some modern medicines had unexpected connections to older traditions. Not because the old systems had been entirely correct, and not because modern medicine had secretly copied them, but because scientists often began by studying observations that had accumulated over generations. A plant used historically might contain a biologically active compound. A traditional remedy might inspire a research question. The scientific method would then test, reject, modify, or confirm those observations. The process was messy, but it revealed something important. History was not a clean break between old and new. It was a transfer. Some ideas survived the journey, others did not. And that realization changed how historians viewed the entire period. The story was no longer simply about what disappeared. It was also about what crossed the bridge into the future. The deeper researchers looked, the more examples they found. Some treatments vanished completely. Some evolved. Some reappeared in forms their original users would barely recognize. The boundaries between victory and defeat became harder to define. Meanwhile, the archives kept yielding surprises. Letters from physicians, student records, editorial arguments, personal correspondence. Each document added another layer. Each layer revealed another human story, and together they pointed toward a larger conclusion. The most important legacy of the Flexner era wasn't the closure of a single school. It was the creation of a new medical world. A world that would dominate the 20th century. A world whose benefits would save countless lives, but also a world that left behind unanswered questions about what had been discarded along the way. Those questions would not disappear. In fact, by the end of the century, they were beginning to return. Researchers, historians, medical scholars, even ordinary readers were rediscovering records that had sat untouched for decades. The profession itself was gone, but the conversation was starting again. And that conversation would become the final chapter of our story. By the 1970s, most Americans had never heard of eclectic medicine. If you asked a medical student about the Eclectic Medical Institute, chances are they wouldn't recognize the name. The profession that had once trained thousands of physicians had faded so completely from public memory that many people assumed it had never been important in the first place. That assumption didn't survive contact with the archives. As historians began digging into old collections, they encountered a very different reality. The records revealed a movement that had once operated hospitals, published journals, influenced medical debates, and educated generations of doctors. It wasn't a footnote. For decades, it had been part of the American medical landscape. That discovery forced historians to ask a new question. How does something that's significant become almost forgotten? The answer wasn't destruction. That was one of the biggest surprises. Many people expected to find evidence that records had been systematically eliminated. Instead, they found something stranger. The documents were often still there, waiting on shelves, stored in archives. preserved in libraries. The challenge wasn't finding them. The challenge was knowing they existed. One researcher visiting Cincinnati's Lloyd Library later described the experience as opening a door into a parallel version of American medical history. There were journals he'd never seen cited in modern textbooks, professional debates he'd never heard discussed, entire careers that had largely vanished from public memory. And the deeper he looked, the more complicated the story became. Because the archives didn't just preserve the voices of eclectic physicians, they preserved their disagreements. Some believed the profession should have adapted more aggressively. Others believed adaptation had already gone too far. Some blamed funding pressures. Others blamed changing public expectations. There was no single explanation. Even the people who lived through the collapse couldn't fully agree on why it happened. Why does this matter? Because history becomes much more interesting when real people disagree. The moment everyone tells the same story, something important is usually missing. The archives restored those missing voices, and those voices revealed another fascinating pattern. Many physicians living through the reforms didn't think they were witnessing the end of a profession. They thought they were living through a difficult transition. Again and again, letters from the period reveal optimism, plans for new programs, hopes for revitalization, ideas for reform. People rarely recognize historical endings while they're happening. The professors teaching their final classes didn't know they were teaching final classes. Students enrolling in the early 1930s didn't know they belonged to the last generation. History only looks inevitable in hindsight. At the time, the future was uncertain. That uncertainty makes the story feel remarkably human, because we've all experienced moments that seemed ordinary until years later. Only then do we realize we were watching the end of something. The final years of eclectic medicine were filled with those moments. A graduating class that would never have successors. A journal issue that would become one of the last. A faculty meeting discussing problems that would soon become irrelevant. People living their lives without realizing they were standing at the edge of history. And yet, despite all the closures, not everything vanished. This is where the story takes one final, unexpected turn. Many ideas associated with older medical traditions survived in indirect ways, some through scientific investigation, some through community practices, some through historical scholarship, some through archives preserved by people like John Uri Lloyd. The profession disappeared. The influence did not. Historians studying medical education today still debate the consequences of the Flexner era. Most agree that the reforms dramatically improved standards. Most agree that scientific medicine achieved extraordinary successes. But many also acknowledge that historical change always involves trade-offs. Every system preserves some things and leaves others behind. The question is what those losses and gains actually were. And that's where our story arrives at its final discovery. After all the reports, closures, debates, reforms, and archives, the most important lesson may have nothing to do with eclectic medicine at all. It may be about how societies decide which ideas deserve a future. Because that decision wasn't made once in 1910. It happens constantly. In science, in education, in politics, in culture. Every generation inherits more knowledge than it can carry forward. Every generation chooses what to keep. And every generation leaves something behind. The physicians who fought over medical education a century ago couldn't know how their choices would shape the future. But they did shape it, in ways both supporters and critics would have struggled to imagine. And understanding those consequences leads directly to the final question of our story. More than a century after the Flexner Report, what is the true legacy of the world that disappeared? And why are people still arguing about it today? More than a century after Abraham Flexner began his tour of medical schools, the argument still isn't over. Not because people are trying to bring back the world of 1900, and not because historians have failed to find the evidence. In many ways, the opposite is true. We know more about that era today than the people living through it ever could. The reports survived. The letters survived. The journals survived. The student records survived. And because they survived, we can see something the participants themselves could not. We can see the entire arc of the story. In 1900, the United States had one of the most diverse medical landscapes in the world. More than 150 medical schools competed for students. Different philosophies competed for patients. Doctors argued over treatments, education, and the future of medicine itself. Then came reform. Within a generation, the number of medical schools had been dramatically reduced. Scientific medicine became dominant. Research institutions grew in power. Medical education became far more standardized. The results were profound. The 20th century brought antibiotics, improved surgery, modern diagnostics, and medical breakthroughs that saved millions of lives. For supporters of reform, that outcome justified the transformation. Yet the archives reveal another side of the story. Not a hidden side, a human side. The side experienced by students who watched their schools disappear. Professors who saw careers come to an end. Editors who published final journal issues. Librarians who packed away collections no longer needed. Their experiences rarely appear in broad historical summaries, but they mattered, because history is not only shaped by what survives, it is also shaped by what disappears. Think back to that graduation ceremony in Cincinnati in 1939. The students crossing the stage had spent years preparing for a profession that was nearing its end. Some adapted successfully. Some entered mainstream medicine. Some carried pieces of their training into private practice. Others simply watched the world change around them. None of them knew that future historians would one day study their final graduating class. To them, it was just another graduation. History often works that way. The people living through major turning points rarely recognize them in the moment. A school closes. A journal stops publishing. A professor retires. A student graduates. Years later, those ordinary moments become historical milestones. Why does this matter? Because it reminds us that the most important changes in history are not always dramatic. Sometimes they happen quietly. Sometimes they happen one decision at a time. And sometimes their consequences become visible only decades later. That is exactly what happened here. The Flexner era reshaped American medicine. Few historians would dispute that. What they continue to debate is how we should understand the cost of that transformation. Some emphasize the extraordinary gains. Others focus on the traditions that disappeared. Most agree on one thing. The story is too complex to fit neatly into a single narrative. And perhaps that's why it continues to fascinate people, because it forces us to confront questions that still matter. Who decides which ideas deserve support? How should institutions balance tradition and innovation? What knowledge is worth preserving? What risks are worth taking in pursuit of progress? Those questions didn't end in 1910. They simply took new forms. The people at the center of this story never found final answers. Neither have we, but they left something behind that may be even more valuable. A record, not a perfect record, not a complete one, but enough for future generations to investigate, question, and learn from. John Uri Lloyd understood that. While others fought over the future, he spent years preserving the past, because he suspected that one day people would want to look back and understand what had happened. He was right. Today, researchers still visit the collections he helped preserve. Historians still study the documents. Students still uncover forgotten details. And every so often, someone opens a box, unfolds a letter, or reads a journal that hasn't been touched in decades. Suddenly, voices from a vanished world speak again. Not because the past returned, because the evidence survived. And perhaps that is the real legacy of this story. Not the victory of one side, not the defeat of another, but the survival of the record itself. The ability to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, to look beyond simple explanations. and to remember that history is rarely as straightforward as it first appears. Before we finish, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel and how many people share a curiosity about the forgotten corners of history. The students from that final graduating class are gone now. So are the professors who taught them. So are most of the people who fought the battles we've explored tonight. But their story remains, waiting in archives, waiting in libraries, waiting in old journals and fading letters, waiting for someone curious enough to keep asking questions. And as long as those questions continue to be asked, the story is not truly over. It's simply waiting for the next chapter to be discovered. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most consequential transformations in American medical history. Until our next exploration into the forgotten echoes of the past, take care of yourselves. And remember, history is not only what happened, history is what we choose to remember.